talk of today is integrating systems through their APIs, where API is application programming interface. The notion of this presentation is that I'm going to give you an introduction to this marvelous technology called Node-RED, originally developed by IBM, just as a side hustle style project that they eventually decided, let's go and open source it. We're going to have a brief look at something that we Brits love to talk about. We're then going to have a look at more serious application of getting APIs to talk to each other in the form of getting a next generation firewall to send alerts into a help desk. And we're then also going to make it so that by clicking buttons inside your help desk can then send information back to the firewall as well. And of course, that's just the beginning of your journey on this wonderful world of APIs, so introduce you to a couple of other ideas, a couple of other things that you can go and have a look at, and then wrap up with any questions that you might have. So Node-RED, as I mentioned earlier there, it's a project that was started by these wonderful people in the big blue company of IBM, started in 2013, so a relatively mature piece of software these days. It is open source, so go and feel free to use it as you will. And the real notion of it is to go and write programming, but in a very visual format. So the example that we can see on the top right-hand corner, we start by injecting a timestamp into a web service. The web service then goes and downloads the weather for where I live, and then outputs it into a various load of different streams for other services to then go and consume. So instead of using PowerShell and Python and all these other wonderful, very text-based languages to go and make systems talk to each other, Node-RED is more about using a visual system, this nice drag and drop interface for it. Now, the underlying system behind this all is, of course, JavaScript and Node.js. So if you've got any familiarity with JavaScript programming, you'll have at least a little bit of awareness as to how to write functions and the likes inside Node-RED, as and when you decide that you want to do something a bit more fancy with it. And it is really very much a case of being a Swiss Army knife. So you can do all manner of things with this the moment you start feeding data into it and taking data out and pushing it into other systems. In one case, I even saw someone mangle Node-RED into being a very lightweight, not exactly ideal, but it worked, network access control system. Because they could. There's this marvelous presentation by the people that originally created Node-RED. They presented in 2016, and part of that presentation, the chap asks, is Node-RED capable of ingesting 1 million messages a minute or something along those lines? And the response to that was, it could, but you shouldn't do it like that. Or you could cross the Atlantic Ocean in the bathtub, but you didn't necessarily want to be able to do it so. My personal usage, I've used this for about 3 years now, starting out with microcontrollers. So if you remember the before times and came along to my presentation about microcontrollers, that's how I kind of got involved with this. These are tiny little, really stupid, but really, really useful computers that you can use to go and control systems with. But more recently, it's about getting it to talk to help desk systems, about talking to the various APIs for the technologies that I use. Most recently, though, home automation. I got a new house. I thought, right, I'm finally going to do this. I'm going to make the lights do my own bidding. I'm going to make them come on when I want them to. So Node-RED can also be used for home automation as well. So we are going to do a speed run of an install. If you've got a nice, fast computer, this will only take a couple of minutes, but also Node-RED can be run on very slow single board computers as well. So if you've got a spare Raspberry Pi floating around, you might find that you can run Node-RED on it. Sequence is shortened so that no one tries to sue me. So speed run of install, first we go to the Node-RED website, just search for Node-RED. Along the top there is a documentation page, and the Getting Started guide is where we want to look at. And it then gives you the option of all the different places that you might want to run Node-RED. And in some cases, that's just going to be local, on-premise, on a virtual machine that you've got. They've got Docker containers for those of you who actually understand Docker. I'm still yet to understand the real application for it. I must have a good chat with Chris there, and we'll actually understand it one day. But equally so, various cloud service providers are now offering it as well as a software as a service package. Now what you'll find is if you go and select the running Node-RED locally option, there's the do-it-yourself way, and there's the let a script do all the work for you way. Now if you would like to go and examine that script because you're the paranoid level person that you might be and you want to go and read a couple of 100 lines, fantastic. Please feel free to crack on. But in this case, I've got a Ubuntu virtual machine, and I'm going to completely and utterly crazily paste that script in and allow it to do its stuff. And what you'll get is a nice prompt asking, are you sure? Do you really want to install Node-RED? So we press yes. And then because Node-RED has the ability to talk to certain of the very specific hardware features in a Raspberry Pi, they've got this notion of Pi-specific nodes. So all those different little programming elements are called nodes, and for the Raspberry Pi, some of those are the ability to talk to the GPIO pins, talk I2C, and all those kind of wonderful things that you can do with a Raspberry Pi. This is a Ubuntu virtual machine. It doesn't have any GPIO pins, so we're going to say no. It asks to elevate to administrative privileges, so we go and type in the super secret password for the user IT. Allow it to do its thing. So it downloads all the dependencies for you, installs all the stuff that you need, installs Node-RED. If you've asked it to install the Raspberry Pi stuff, it will go and do it for you. And it will then tell you what you need to do next. This is the kind of Linux software I like. This is the kind of Linux software I can get behind. By the way, it could also run on Windows. Don't try it, though. Run it on Linux. So Node-RED admin init. That's the next command that we're going to go and type. And that is then a really nice semi-visual way of actually setting up things like the administrative account, setting up a long salt for the credentials file, and being able to decide which editor that you want to use. So again, a really nice way to just speed run and install, get started from the very start. And the nice little output at the bottom, and I suggest that if you do set up a Node-RED server, you save this into documentation, because of course all of you have documentation. Save the path to that settings file. You will need it later. Once we've done that, of course, because we like to secure things with HTTPS, the default web server will just open over HTTP with no HTTPS. There is a very nice guide on the website that says, create a private key, create the certificate, dot the certificate chain into the certificate file, stick it into some files on the server there, and you can then hop into the settings file, comment out a couple of lines, give it the path to the private key and the certificate, and that's it. Node-RED is now secure. Secure. Well, maybe. After that, we're then going to tell it to start on boot, and because I'm a Windows person, not a Linux person, and I'm really lazy, I'm just going to reboot the server because I don't want to find the command to go and start it silently. So yes, let's get that restarted, and boom, welcome to Node-RED. At this point, we then have our username and password prompt, and it will also give us a nice little guide to go and get started, as it were. Node-RED will open on a default port of 1880, so whatever the IP address or the host name of your server is, with HTTPS at the front and 1880 at the end, and that will let you in. So out of the box, what do we get? We get this wonderful selection of out-of-the-box nodes. So some of those are a case of let's ingest data. So let's get information from an HTTP request. Some of those are a little bit more low level. So getting information from UDP and TCP. Can anyone figure out how they might have made a network access control system with TCP and UDP? Guess what? Radius. You could convince Node-RED to become a Radius server. Don't do that. Go buy a NAC. And also, it's got all the kind of the visual programming elements that you might want inside there as well. So the ability to split data into multiple elements if you've got a giant data set. The ability to parse information between different formats like CSV, HTML, and also the ability to read and write from the file system. There are a couple of nice elements there on the left-hand side. So function, go write JavaScript. Change and switch and move data between the types of data sets that it operates with, and also execute as well. Go and run a file and execute a file on the local file system as well. That's quite handy if you want to hand off from Node-RED to PowerShell, for instance, because PowerShell runs on Linux. Thank you, PowerShell. So let's do something basic. We're going to set up a very simple web server using Node-RED. Let's see if the video will play. Yes, it will. So we're going to scroll down on the left-hand side. We're going to find HTTP in. We're going to drop that in. We're going to give it a URL. So this is going to be a URL off the end of the Node-RED server. I'm then going to use the template node. This is a nice way for me to write a nice basic response. So I'm just going to put hello world in there. And I'm then going to drop in the HTTP response node and just leave it as it is. Click deploy in the top right-hand corner, and then head to that URL on the Node-RED server. And we get our hello world example. The server has sent back the response of hello world. Okay, let's do something more fancy. Let's go and wrap that up in HTML tags for H1 now. And then again, press done. Don't forget to press deploy in the top right-hand corner. And now we've changed that content, so when we refresh, we see it in an H1. Very simple web server, right? let's do something a little bit more dynamic. Let's go and find this HTTP-in node. Oh, no, wrong video. In this example, we used HTTP-in, accept responses, the template node, figure out what you're going to give back in response, the response node, which is actually send the response back to the client. Those connectors that I drew between the different nodes are known as wires, and inside that template node, we can put some basic HTML formatting in there as well. I've even made little Bootstrap-based websites as well. Again, just building a nice static HTML page, putting the Bootstrap CSS inside there and making something quite pretty. So let's do something more fancy. We're going to take our hello world example, and in the URL, I'm going to put a URL parameter. It's going to be data equals 123456. Now I want to see what that looks like as far as the Node-RED server is concerned. So I'm dropping in what's known as the debug node here. So when I refresh that request, I can see in the debug panel on the right-hand side there that the Node-RED server received the key value pair of data 123456. Now by using what's known as mustache templating, or by going payload.data, because that's the path to that field, I can now make that page dynamic. So now when I put 1234567889 in there, the content updates because I've put that URL parameter in there. So suddenly we've made something a bit more dynamic. And of course we can read that information out and improve upon that, use that in other magical ways. We'll come back around to this a little bit later in the presentation. So that's our simple hello world example. Now the plugins to Node-RED. If you want to talk to an API service that's relatively well used, let's think about Microsoft Teams. Sorry, the people in Oxford. The University of Oxford has decided to disable this wonderful thing called webhooks, which allows you to push messages from Node-RED into Microsoft Teams. I don't know what the situation is like in Cambridge. But plugins, the palette there is used for you to extend the functionality of Node-RED. So let's go and hunt for one of these. What I want to do now is start storing secrets. And I want to do it in a manner that it's going to store it inside that encrypted blob. So if I go to Manage Palette and head over to Install and look for something called Secrets, there's a plugin there called Credentials. And this plugin allows me to store secrets inside that node, inside the encrypted blob inside Node-RED, to use within the flows. And equally so, by doing it with this mechanism, I can be sure that if I ever export the information out of Node-RED, perhaps because I want to share it with someone else to go and make a similar flow, a similar usage of this API system, they can do it, but without actually sharing the credentials with them. It's a nice way of making sure you don't actually go and leak things. So let's have a look at my next example, which is how we're actually going to use that. So once it starts, come on, start video. So I could scroll up and down like a Neanderthal, or I could go to the search box in the top right-hand corner there, search for credentials, drop that in, and then let's go and figure out how this works. And what you'll find in the top right-hand corner, there is a nice little help dialog, and that will bring up a window like the one on the bottom right-hand corner. And sometimes the help guides are stored on GitHub, sometimes the developer has actually gone and put them in Node-RED, but quite often you'll find that they've got decent examples. So let's go and inject in what's known. Oh no, let's go and inject in our credentials first. So I'm going to use 1234567889, super secure password. It's 9 characters long. And I'm going to store that in what's known as message.api key. So this is a nice little place that I can keep information. I'm going to use the inject node and the debug node, and I'm going to draw a line between them all. This will definitely work. I then deploy my flow, and by clicking on the button to the left-hand side of the timestamp on the inject node, I can see a nice timestamp has been injected into the flow. Unfortunately, that's not what I was expecting. I was expecting to see the API key. Something's gone wrong. Okay, so let's have a look there at the debug node. Okay, so I was only looking at message payload. I wasn't actually looking at the API key. Let's return the complete message object. Don't forget to press deploy. We're going to inject again. Oh, there's a bit more information inside there, but it's still not the right information. Something's still going wrong. Maybe I haven't... No, it's definitely in there. Maybe I haven't actually plugged it in. Okay, let's check I've plugged it in. Oh, I haven't plugged it in. When drawing your wires, ensure that you connect nodes to each other. Don't try and just draw a line all the way through them. So now when I press deploy, I press that inject button to set this flow off. I'll actually see the API key mentioned there in the top right-hand corner, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So don't forget to plug everything in. So that example, we've now got the inject node, make something happen. So just as the HTTP in node can be used to say, when you receive an HTTP request, do something, the inject node is quite nice when you're testing, when you're developing, let's just push a button to make something happen. We've got the credentials node in there. As you might have seen, there are a couple of other plugins for credentials. One of the things that I usually look at when I'm choosing a good plugin is there's a nice star rating system, but also when did someone last push a commit to it? When did someone last go and update that plugin in GitHub? Make sure it's something that's being actively maintained. Don't forget that everything needs to be joined together. Don't just try and draw wires between things. It doesn't work like that. Draw wires between the individual connecting nodes. And of course, help guides are often included with examples. So let's do something a little bit fun. We like to talk about the weather. So weatherbit.io, this wonderful API service where you can sign up for a free account, get what's known as an API key. So this is your ability to talk to the API without having to enter a username and password. Quite handy for these kinds of systems. I used to use something called Dark Skies. If you ever came across Dark Skies, brilliant app. Guess what? Apple went and bought it. Grr, Apple. You can make 500 requests to them in a single day. So if you make one request an hour, you're going to use 24. Plenty more that you can use to go and query what the weather is like in Kuala Lumpur, of course. So their API has some documentation. And what we're usually looking for is first, how do we authenticate to the API? How do we actually say, this is me? And in this case, just as we had earlier, we're going to use URL request parameters. We're going to use a key value pair. In this case, they're expecting the key to be known as key and the value to be your API key. So question mark, key equals your API key. Stick that in the URL, and that's you authenticated. Now, what they're also expecting you to do, again, as key value pairs go, is inject in where do you actually want the weather for. And if we've got these URL parameters and we want to string multiple of them together, we use the AND symbol. So in this case, AND city equals the name of your city, and country equals the country code that you're in. They also then, quite handily, give you an example of what the expected response is going to be. Now, you might find for some APIs, the response is going to come in the XML format. You might find that the more modern ones come in what's known as JSON, or JavaScript Object Notation. I do like it when they give you a full example as well as to how things are actually going to be when they come back to you as well. Sometimes they truncate them, and it's a little bit of a pain to see, is this API going to be actually of use to you? So I've set up a very simple flow here. We started out with a timestamp. We've then injected the credentials node, and the credentials node is storing the API key. We've then got an HTTP request, so that's me making the request out to weatherbit, and then we've got the debug node there in the form of the message payload node to actually give us the response. When it comes to the credentials node, here I've got that API key nice and set to private now, so we can't actually see it. That's being saved to message.api. And if we have a closer look at the HTTP request node, you can just see on the right-hand side there, we've got question mark key equals, and we've then got that moustache templating going on as well. So behind that, it's then got message.api key. So this information is passed along the flow as you go. It's kind of like the pipe symbol inside PowerShell. And most importantly, as part of this HTTP request node at the bottom, I'm expecting to get back JSON. I've told it, when you receive this information, expect JSON to come back. So my full request there, I live in the town of Whitney, so I've got my API key. I've put in the city of Whitney. It's not a city, it's a town. And the country of GB for Great Britain. So let's get that running, and let's go and have an explore as to what we actually see. So I'm going to push that inject timestamp. You can see it briefly go through the HTTP request. And if I zoom in there, I can then start to use this nice little explorer to actually see what the data I've got is. So in this case, if I click down and go through that little setup, I can see the timestamps for when the moon rises and when the sunset is, and when all this good stuff is going to be, what's the temperature going to be like today, what's the weather that I'm expecting to see. In this case, it's going to be broken clouds, all that good information. And equally so, I can click through the rest of this to go and have a look at the weather forecast for future days. And in this case, as part of the free API, you get the weather for 16 days. So let's do something a little bit more useful than just kick out a nice blob of JSON. Let's actually go and write a weather report, like the one that I've got here. And here I've started to then use what's known as the function node, so I can go and write some nice basic JavaScript. So I've got message.payload, so that's going to be my output, equals, and then, because we're using JavaScript here, we've then got the paths to all the bits of information that I'm interested in. We're using the plus symbol to go and join things together. Note it's nicely formatted over multiple lines. And I've also then gone and used two lowercase. So broken clouds, if you noticed it earlier, have a capital B. If I want my weather format to be nice and formatted for it, I want to go and put that into lowercase. So now I need somewhere to put that. I could email that to myself. It's very 1980s though, email. Let's use something a little bit more interesting. So I use the Todoist task management app. Guess what? It has an API. So for this, I go and have a read of the documentation. I go, oh, we've got this wonderful thing called create a new task. So I can go and put a new task into my task management app with the weather report in. So I can ensure that I read the weather report and then say, yes, I've read it at the beginning of the day. One slight difference. Up to now, we've just been asking for information. We've just been getting information. So our HTTP request has been get. What we're now doing is putting information into another service. So we're now doing what's known as an HTTP post. And you'll see up there in the example, the curl or the CURL request has got post mentioned as well. I must start zooming into some of these to make life easier. Don't worry, it'll all be on myworldofit.net at the end of this presentation, hopefully. So let's tie everything together. I'm going to say at 8 a.m. every day on a repeat, inject in the API key for WeatherBit, send the request off to WeatherBit, process the string that comes out of it to generate my weather response, inject in the API key for Todoist, build all the information I need for Todoist, and then send all that up into Todoist to go and give me that task. Now, the function node, as well as being used to go and create the payload, to go and create the information that we're actually going to process in, we can also use it to format things like message headers. So if you've ever had a look at API calls, ever had a look at HTTP requests, you'll come across headers. And that's where we tell it that it's expecting to receive JSON data. The authentication mechanism that I'm using is known as bearer authentication. There are so many different ways of authenticating yourselves to APIs. At the end of this, I've got a slide which shows all the 4 different methods that were actually used here. That I'm going to inject the message in using message.weatherreports, the project ID that I want to go in. And one of the really nice things about Todoist is it understands what's known as natural language. So I can tell it to give me a reminder at 9 a.m. for me to read the weather report. Instead of having to go and write out a long date timestamp that says precisely at this day, at precisely this time, I can just tell it 9 a.m. and it'll go and process that and drop that in as a nice task. So that makes life a whole lot easier. Note that I've got the method there set to post. I'm going to post that message into Todoist. And again, I'm expecting a JSON response at the end of it to say, yes, I've done that. Let's go and have a look-see how that actually works, how that actually runs. So I've kicked that off. You can see it making calls to the APIs. And boom, there's my task now appeared in the top right-hand corner there with the weather. Right? Handy stuff. Now, you might be thinking, I've done this before. I'm sure there's a marvelous service that I can do this with. And yes, that's called if this, then that. Right? The problem here, though, is they have access to all your data at this point, and you have to pay them if you want to do anything at a decent scale, and there's no way to integrate with on-prem applications, as it were. Whereas Node-RED, so long as you're willing to have a look through and figure out how the APIs work, you control all that stuff. Absolutely marvelous. So let's do something that we wouldn't want to do with the likes of if this, then that. Or indeed, you might have come across Microsoft Flow and Power Automate and other tools like this. All of these talk to APIs to go and achieve their objectives, and Node-RED is just another way of doing it. But let's use a nice example that we might actually use, a Palo Alto Network's next generation firewall. What I want to be able to do is to be informed when something malicious happens. I then want to cut that user's internet access off, because if there's something malicious happening on their computer and I don't want them calling home to a ransomware service, for instance, we're going to cut their internet off. I'm going to generate a help desk ticket via the API. And I'm then also going to give the help desk administrator the ability to unblock that user's internet access and give them that back without them having to log into the firewall. Make life a little bit easier for our help desk users there. So FRESHDESK, I'm going to use FRESHDESK as the example here for a help desk. If you're getting a help desk now, if you're getting any product now, see if it's got an API. If it doesn't, it probably sucks. Right? FRESHDESK. These are one of the companies that actually started with the API first and then built their web-based interface on top of the API. That's the best way of doing things. And you might find some other companies that have done it the other way around. They started out with an old school database and a nice web layer on top of it, and then they went and bolted on the API later. And all too often, you'll find that those kinds of companies don't have every feature in the API yet because they're lazy. But hey, let's have a look. So, oh look, they've got a version 2 of their API. Let's use that, grand stuff. First, we're going to read about how we authenticate to it. In this case, they're expecting me to use basic authentication, so I send the API key as the username, followed by the colon there, followed by just anything as the password. They'll just accept anything. You just send in the username as the API key. Again, they're expecting a header here. They're expecting to receive JSON data from me. Let's go and have a closer look as to how I actually go and create a ticket. Note that again, because I'm putting new information, I'm posting new information into their service, I use the HTTP post method. And again, they've given me a nice example of what kind of information I can ship in and what kind of response that I'm expecting back. So that's FRESHDESK. Let's look at the firewall as well. So in the case of the firewall, I can get an API key by pushing in the username and password of an administrator. It then gives me a response with a nice long string for the API there. And it also gives me a nice guide on how I actually automate both the blocking of IP addresses and the unblocking of IP addresses inside the internal firewall system itself as well. All that information, in this case, they're not expecting JSON data, they're expecting XML data. So you'll find that some APIs might use XML, some might use JSON, some might use, I don't know, YAML. I've not come across one yet that uses YAML. But don't worry, it's not a markup language. And we'll go from there. So inside the firewall, it has the ability itself to talk to APIs. If your firewall doesn't have the ability to talk to APIs, you probably need a new firewall. I know some people who can help there. In this case, a couple of weird quirks about Palo Alto networks. They expect you to fill in a username and password, and they expect you to fill in the payload field. Just put anything you like in there. The bit that we're really interested in, I am going to zoom in for this, is parameters. So here I've got SRC, which is the source IP address, so the IP address of the device that was doing something malicious. Because the firewall can be aware of the user, not that I'm going to use it in this demonstration, it's a very short demonstration. I'm looking for the source user, and I'm also outputting the URL as well. So let's go and find which address that they've actually visited and drop that into the API as well. Short example, I'm just going to use the IP address for this. So inside the firewall, I can create what's known as a log forwarding profile, and this says that if someone goes and visits bbc.co.uk, that we should send a notice to Node-RED, and that we should also, inside the firewall, mark them now as a high-risk IP address. We mustn't visit the BBC. In reality, we might set the category there to phishing. We might say, if you visited a phishing website, guess what? No internet for you. By the way, here's a nice phishing simulation to ensure that, or here's some training to ensure that you are aware of how to spot phishers and the likes. And equally so, we've got that tagging element there. So we've said to the source IP address, tell the firewall for its internal service to mark them as a high-risk address. I've then got two rules in the firewall. The rule number 10 there is allowing clients out to the internet. They then match that log forwarding profile. And guess what? If they get tagged as a high-risk address, welcome to the internal high-risks address group. At which point you can see that their traffic is now being denied at rule number 8 before it hits rule number 10. No internet access for you. If we were really paranoid, we'd just cut off all access. Maybe with the exception of the IT help desk to be able to actually get into their machine. So let's plug this all together. Let's get this working. So we've got two flows here. These strings of nodes with wires connecting them are known as flows. So the first one is our incoming alert. Node-RED has been informed that someone has done something malicious. The first thing that I want to do is send a response back to the firewall to say, yes, thank you for that message. Otherwise, it just sits there trying to time out. So don't forget to put a response there at the end. I'm then going to start formatting the message. I'm then going to start injecting message headers. I'm then going to inject the API key for FRESHDESK. I've also formatted this in base 64, what you might find occasionally when you ship information up to APIs, if there's weird characters in the API key, that it's best to format them in base 64. It just makes sure it actually makes it to the service at the other end. I'm then going to format my authentication, make the call to FRESHDESK to say generate a help desk ticket. Now inside that help desk ticket, I'm also going to give the help desk operator the ability to click a link which takes them to Node-RED, which also sends a message back to the firewall to say, all clear, remove that user from that known malicious list. And again, there at the bottom flow, known as all clear, there's a nice message that comes back that says client has been unblocked. Yes, they're now permitted back to the internet. And we've also injected in the API key for the firewall and made a request to the firewall to say, hey, everything's good, please crack on. So let's have a closer look here. What we've got in our function node, well, no, actually in our formatting node there, is our nice long string, and you can see that moustache formatting has come back in. So request req.query.src, that's the IP address of the client that went and visited that malicious website. And we've got some nice text in there that says, oh dear, a user has visited a malicious website. And because I've put that nice little bit of HTML formatting in there, so a BR for a new line, visit HTTPS, the path to the Node-RED server, all clear equals that little bit of URL formatting there, that little bit of URL parameter there to go and unblock their internet access. Tying all these systems together, removing the need for the administrator to actually go and log into the firewall to unblock that access. When it comes to the firewall side, it's expecting things in XML. XML is a little bit ugly, all that XML at the end. But again, you can see the moustache templating going on. Here, I've got it with 3 curly brackets instead of 2. 3 includes some nice stuff for, what's the best way to put it? Escape characters and the likes. So if you've got some weird characters inside there, the full stop occasionally trips things up. So I've got that in with 3 instead of 2. And again, we've got a get message. We're expecting all clear back. We're expecting the parameter there to include the IP address. We've got the template node at the top right-hand corner, which says, well done, this IP address has been unblocked. And then at the bottom there, we've got the nice long request that we post into the firewall to say, hey, this user is now going to be unblocked. So let's make it so. Let's see a demonstration of this end to end. So let's start play here. So the user is going to visit this highly malicious website. Oh dear. And you can now feel the APIs churning away in the background. And any second now, Fresh Service or FRESHDESK goes, new ticket. So we click on the ticket, we have a look inside it, and we go, oh dear, the user has visited a malicious website. Here's the link that you can use to go and unblock their access. So let's go and try and visit the internet. Let's go to cheese.com. No cheese for you. Space is very big. Surely we can get to space. No space for you. Cool, okay. Let's unblock their access. Let's say we've been onto their machine, cleaned things up. So as the help desk agent, without having to log into the firewall itself, I'm going to click that link. It's going to send a nice message back to say that IP address has been unblocked. Feel the churn of the APIs. They take a second or 2 to do their work. And now if I visit cheese.com, I can learn all about cheese. So this is a very simple example of how this might be applied in the real world. One of the bits that people have asked me quite recently is, what if a user does fall for a phish? And I want some kind of centralized system to say, let's give them some training. Let's point them at KnowBe4. Let's point them at some other service to say, by the way, you need some training. So how about the API call there detects the fact that they visited a phishing website, injects into KnowBe4 to say they now need to do some training, and KnowBe4 then makes the call back into email to say, here's your training, go do some training. Equally so, we might be able to use systems like this to inject extra information into the help desk. So if they visited a potentially really malicious website, Maybe through the API, we set the criticality or the ability to, or the need to respond to this urgently to a much higher value than a normal ticket. Something which you can do with email, but it's just a little bit of a faff. What if we wanted to report on particular users' names and have it ensure that the user's name is actually linked in the help desk ticket? We could do that through the API as well. All these things which are really easy to do through the APIs that are a little bit of a faff to do with older methods like email and even syslog, for example. So it really doesn't stop there. Node-RED is, as you might understand, infinitely flexible, a true Swiss Army knife. There are some things you just shouldn't do with it, and there are plenty of other things that are really actually quite handy to do with it. One of those is to go and generate dashboards. So there is a plugin to go and make funky dashboards. So if, for instance, you've got a little microcontroller sitting in your server room with a nice little temperature sensor on it, instead of having to pay £1,000 for one of those fancy appliances that will tell you all this information, you can go and buy a £5 microcontroller and a £10 sensor and wire the two together and have it sending its information into Node-RED and giving you a nice dashboard. Or perhaps you've got PRTG Network Monitor or Nagios or any of the other ones. Guess what? They've all got APIs. So we could get that tiny little microcontroller to send the information into Node-RED. Node-RED sends the information into your monitoring system, and then it keeps track of the temperature over time. Truly flexible. For those of you who want to do things at scale, there's an API for the API service, where you can do the bulk generation of these flows. So if you've got the need to make something really big, guess what? You can use the API to go and do that. If you need to talk to databases, for instance, MySQL, SQL, all those kinds of things, we can inject queries into those databases from Node-RED. So if you want to move data from one place to another, Node-RED might be a real opportunity for you to be able to do that. And when it comes to home automation, Lyfix light bulbs. Damn expensive, but guess what? They're really quite bright. I like them at least. There are nodes for that. Down to the level that if you walk into my house at different periods of times of the day, Node-RED has already told the light bulbs what color temperature they should be at to match the pattern of the sun. So in the evenings, it's a bit more of a dull orange, whilst during the middle of the day, it's a bright blue. All of these things can be accomplished with APIs. To finish off, authentication. Authentication is a real pain because no one agreed a standard. There's probably a standard for the standard, for the standard of the standard. But in this example alone, we've used 4 different mechanisms for authentication. The thing that you can really use, though, to help get an understanding is to learn curl, learn CURL, because that's what most of the examples come in. And if you can figure out how those pieces wire together, great. Last proper takeaways is if you're buying something new, make sure it's got an API. You can get a lot of extra value out of those products, out of those tools by integrating with the APIs, getting systems to talk with each other. And enrich notifications into help desks, like the example I gave you there with the firewall, is a nice place to start. Now you might have noticed actually when it created the ticket, it actually created 2. Right? And that was because when you visit the BBC website, it actually goes to BBC and also BBC Images as well. And again, through the API and by plugging into things like Node-RED, we might be able to suppress those duplicates. Or indeed, if a user has already visited a malicious website and they're trying to visit another malicious website, we can have it so it updates the ticket which already exists. It's just a case of figuring out how those APIs talk and getting used to them. So, final slide before we go on to questions. I'm the imposter here. I've got nothing to do with Oxford and not Cambridge anymore. I used to work for Queen's College. I now work for AN Security. We do fun stuff when it comes to networks, firewalls, switching, wireless. If you like the idea of giving every student their own personal VLAN, which they can access from a shared SSID using pre-shared keys, we've got a solution for that. AN Security, come talk to us. We're not out there because we're not sponsoring it. I'm just here for the fun of it. Questions? We've got 5 minutes left. Chris?
If you've got a web API that uses something like Swagger API or OpenAPI,
yes.
And you point Node-RED at it, has it got some kind of mechanism for generating?
There is a plugin for that, Chris. So Swagger or OpenAPI is a method of publishing the documentation onto how to talk to your API, if that's a correct example, yeah. And there is actually a plugin for Node-RED which will go and read that documentation and generate all the nodes for you. Yes. So the one which I did was for Ruckus Wireless Smart Zone controllers. That is a service that was API first, Web UI second. So everything you can do in the Web UI can be done through the API. In one particular case, they wanted to do something really wacky with when SSIDs get turned on and off that wasn't possible with the built-in tools. So we went and pointed it at the Swagger API. It generated all the information for us, and then just built it in Node-RED. Yeah. I have no idea. I'm not a Linux person, so.
Okay, I was just thinking that like it's so visual that although there are various front ends for kind of automation tools,
Yep.
this could be quite useful if you're working with something that doesn't have easily accessible API.
Yeah.
So for instance, the old firewall that you mentioned,
Yes.
it has an API, but it's suboptimal.
It sucks. Yeah.
Then having something that you could just point to it and say execute the script, because there's a script.
Yep.
Also, presumably, actually, that will solve it.
So one other example is website scraping. I use Node-RED to do a lot of website scraping. One of those things is there's a product page which includes all of the end-of-life dates for a particular product. Unfortunately, they went and made all the dates in like wildly different formats. So some of them it's like day, month, year, great. Sometimes it's month, day, year because they're Americans, and sometimes it's like numerals, and then the year, which is great, and sometimes it's Tuesday. And it's like, for God's sake, I don't want to go and do this heavy lifting. I'll get Node-RED to do it for me because it's got a plugin for naturally understanding dates and then converting them to a standard format. Right? There's a little over 3,000 plugins in their database, and there's probably a plugin for what you want to do, unless it's using Radius, because you shouldn't use Node-RED to make a network access control system. Last question, Gunnar?
The example you showed with BBC,
Yes.
user's IP address.
Yes.
What if the user gets a different IP address?
Okay, so that's a firewall question. If I were to answer that as James Preston from AN Security, what I would actually be doing there is either not blocking based upon the IP address, but the actual physical device itself. So there's this wonderful tool that we can use to profile a device and say, if this device changes IP address, still treat it as that device and write the rule based upon the device's identity. Or, earlier we had the user name in there as well. What we might want that to do is actually follow that block around based upon the user's name instead. So there are plenty of other ways of doing that. But that's a firewall question instead of a Node-RED question, really. But we can do that because that's next-generation firewalls and not your pfSense boxes. Anyway, if there's no other questions, thank you very much for joining us. If you want to come see me later, if you want to get some time from AN Security to do fun things with APIs, great. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you very much.